Welcome to the complete guide to Google Analytics 4. This video summarizes Chapter 8, which is validating your GA4 tracking code. And it was written by Search Discovery's own Chima Umeakune. Chima is a senior analytics associate at Search Discovery. He's got experience in Google Analytics and Adobe Analytics, and he specializes in analytics support. He advises clients on best practices, leveraging their data for implementations, business impact, reporting, QA, all kinds of things. So Chima, welcome.
All right. Can you see me? There I am. Hey there.
Thanks for joining. So I appreciate your chapter. Again, we're talking about QA and validation. And one of the themes that I saw that you wrote about was trust. And so I wanted to talk about how the validation process can be used to build trust, but also, what are some common mistakes that analysts can make that cause others to see data as untrustworthy?
Oh, wow. It's a very good question. And for testing, for QA, trust is essential. It literally is the essential for building and maintaining trust in data. And that is done by maintaining a record for QA documentation. That is the secret. It's no bigger secret sauce. You must have a record that is the reference document for your implementation. Without this, and that was the biggest issue for any analyst, I would say, is this: without that document to reference, you really cannot establish trust. You really cannot see that everything that we say is going on in implementation is working. There's no validation system, there's no record of reference. And that is unfortunate when that is not the case, because when you go and the other side is when this becomes relevant, is when you start using your implementation, you start building reports, you start trying to actually utilize the data to make some informed decisions. Well, if you don't have a record of what the metrics and dimensions you're referencing, what they're doing, are they actually functioning correctly? And when you start looking at your reports and start seeing something weird and odd, well, there you go.
Yeah.
You don't want to be in a situation. That's why we always, SDI, recommend that you establish a proper testing documentation.
Yeah. And I can throw a quick anecdote in there. Early in my career, I was asked to show up at a meeting where somebody opened a report that had no data in it that absolutely should have a very important checkout flow. And I didn't have good documentation to point back to say, I tested at this date in this way, and this was working. So as a result, I think I had a hit to the trust that people put in me and in the data, right? So, one of the things that I like as well about the way you lay out the process of validating is you break it into these two high-level categories. So you talk about there's important validation that goes on and when you're creating a beacon, and then there's a separate process that happens after that beacon is sent to Google, where data processing occurs and reports are built. So I just want to see if you can just explain the differences between these two, a little bit about what's happening and why it's helpful to think of validation in these two separate categories.
Great point. And I would say that the beacon creation part is the most intuitive part, I would say. That's, and please go and read the chapter, and it goes way more in depth in here. But essentially, creating a beacon involves the client-side browser executing a rule and pulling from the original data source. And like we recommend the data layer, but you also could pull from the DOM elements or from the SDK, various sources. But that's essential for the creation of that beacon and data signature that is going to hit our platform and we use for reporting. And the thing about that is that if you are not, that's basically the essential area that you want to test and the area that we focused on for the test case documentation. If you are then going to look at the data processing part, that on the flip side is once that's received, and both sides are going to be shown in the report at the end of the day. But if you just look at the reports and say, hey, I'm not seeing a proper hit, you don't have as much information. And that's where we go in. I recommend various tools that actually go into check the beacon creation step, because that's where the majority of your issues lie from the data layer pulling. There's a whole bunch of very common issues that occur from when you want to create that beacon. And we recommend that you focus on that step. And then once that's passed, you then need to go into your reports and check to see, well, hey, we see that a beacon was created, but Is it hitting the right property? Is the property side developed? Is there any issue in terms of we're getting unspecified? We're seeing a lot of null values, but that we shouldn't see. And there's a whole bunch of conditions that occur afterwards, but those are a lot less common. And so it's important that you break it up to these steps and make sure to focus on the beacon creation process first.
Right. Yeah. I think of it as a sequential thing. An action occurs, a bunch of things happen depending on how it's tracked that generate that beacon. And then once Google receives it, something else happens. And so starting at the beginning and following the process lets you see where it's broken. I think that makes a lot of sense. One other thing that I can throw out related to GA4 specifically is that I believe this is still the case. It certainly was early on with GA4 when you fire off e-commerce events. If there's not a currency, those events will look perfectly correct, except that the currency parameter is missing, but they will be ignored once they are received by Google Analytics. So it's a great example of checking a beacon may make you think that you've done everything properly, but actually pulling a report after that's been through processing is the only way to reveal that something is going on that's breaking your data.
Absolutely. It's a very critical step. Make sure you check that report.
Yeah. Well, last question I want to ask has to do with the difficulty in analytics of knowing when tracking code is missing. So an example that I have is if I have 10 forms on my website, 9 of them are tracked correctly, but the 10th was missed. That can be really difficult to find. It's difficult to know there's a problem because your reports might look fine. When you go to test, you test a form that is working. So question is, how do we build confidence that our strategies are complete, and we're not having this kind of false positive error that is actually pretty common in the analytics industry?
That's a great question, and that's really comes down to you having a comprehensive testing plan, and having what we and if you check the chapter, we go into the actually testing process. We simplify it down, and we even have an example instance of the repetition required. And that most critical part of this, and I hope I've emphasized it there, is just the granularity. We focus at the event level and also at the very parameter level. Like every nook and cranny needs to pass. Like even within various use cases, they have various different forms, but for each form, as a scenario, we are looking at for each event, are they unique? Is it the same form? Doesn't matter, but we are checking for the parameter level to make sure every single is passed, it's fired, all the context variables are in place. And that is where you will be able to have an exhaustive way of making sure that this is done correctly. And if you don't, basically, in short, just to reemphasize, you just need to make sure that you are thoroughly checking every single use case and instance possible before you can say it's signed off and it's valid.
Awesome. Well, thank you for your time. Again, the chapter is chapter 8, validating your GA4 tracking code. And Chima, I really appreciate your work. Thank you for joining.
Thank you, Ken. Glad to be here.